Actually, the first lie came when the Soviet Union shot down a CIA spy plane, the U-2 spy plane with Gary Powers, just on the eve of what was supposed to be a summit between Eisenhower and Soviet party chairman Nikita Khrushchev. And the CIA lies for a living. We know this. But it lied to the president of the United States also, saying, Mr. President, don't worry. They can't shoot down the spy plane. It's too high. And if they do shoot down the spy plane, it's designed to disintegrate. And if it doesn't disintegrate anyway, the pilot is going to take his cyanide pill. There's no way anything can happen to embarrass you. And of course, they shoot down the spy plane. They get the wreckage. They get the pilot alive, Gary Powers. They don't announce that. They say we have been spied upon and downed a plane without revealing those details. And Eisenhower comes out and says, no, this is a weather craft that went off course from Turkey. And then the Soviets reveal, we have the fuselage, we have the pilot who has told us about his spy mission, direct, blatant lies. Then soon after this comes the direct, blatant lies of the Bay of Pigs. It's dangerous. And this is the CIA, by the way, and it's the CIA till today, in my view. It is lying and unaccountable and really never called to task for these lies because the public doesn't know them, doesn't understand what's going on. But from the Soviet U.S. point of view, within months of the Kennedy administration, this air was poisoned. And there was one other thing that was absolutely precipitating all of this, which was, and very fundamental and completely never discussed in America almost at all, but there had been no peace treaty at the end of World War II. And the Cold War emerged, in fact, over a bitter dispute between the Soviet Union and the United States about the future of Germany. The Soviet Union had lost more than 20 million people in the war and did not want to see German remilitarized. The United States, on the other hand, decided that the three occupied regions from the western side, the U.S., French, and British regions, would form a single new Federal Republic of Germany. The remaining fourth part, the Soviet-occupied part, would become the German Democratic Republic, the GDR. But the western side would become the bulwark of a new military alliance, NATO, and it would be remilitarized. And the Soviet Union said, no, we just lost more than 20 million people. Now, within a few years, you're remilitarizing. Well, of course, the United States never listened, never negotiated, and at the end of the 1950s, took another step. Eisenhower was flirting with the idea, maybe we should just give our allies control over nuclear weapons as well, so we can reduce the U.S. Troops numbers in Europe. Eisenhower was very frugal. He was a fiscal conservative, and he wanted to bring troops home and use the nuclear shield. And so there was, at the end of the 1950s, lots of talk about nuclear sharing. And this was freaking out the Soviet Union also. And the United States doesn't know how to talk to anybody. There's no diplomacy. There are mortal enemies. There's no one to negotiate. And so the situation by the time Kennedy came in was completely fraught. Then came the Bay of Pigs. Then Khrushchev said, okay, we need to teach Americans a bit of their own lessons. We'll put missiles in Cuba. And Khrushchev had a quite remarkable exchange with Andrei Gromyko, as foreign minister. Gromyko said, no, what, war? And Khrushchev said, no, not war, just basically teach these Americans about their arrogance. They have missiles in Turkey. We're going to put missiles in Cuba. Nothing about war. But of course, everything immediately spiraled out of control when the missile placements were discovered and the subterfuge that the Soviets were using to place the missile systems in place. And it was like the subterfuge of the United States doing what it did on its side. things get out of hand. And as soon as Kennedy saw the U-2 spy plane over Cuba taking these pictures of missile sites, he convened an executive committee, ExComm, and it was almost unanimous. Well, we got to shoot down these sites. We have to take them out before they can be deployed. And it was unanimous, essentially, that there needed to be an immediate war. And the Joint Chiefs were told to go off and plan the military campaign against Cuba. Would it be an air campaign? Would it just be to take out the sites? How many troops would be needed, and so forth? Kennedy, interestingly, to make a very long story short, had lunch by coincidence with Adlai Stevenson, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, on the first day of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Kennedy had seen the pictures. And Adlai Stevenson said to Kennedy, well, of course you need diplomacy to end this, and exchange the missiles with the Turkish missiles. Kennedy was shocked because no other advisor had said anything about diplomacy. It was basically unanimous for a military approach, which, by the way, almost surely may be too strong, although I'm not sure it is, but most likely would have led to nuclear annihilation. Because our doctrine was that if we were attacked by a nuclear weapon, we would give a full response. By the way, full meaning not only the Soviet Union, but Eastern and Central Europe, China, hundreds of millions of people killed. And now we learned afterwards from the nuclear winter, maybe all of humanity perishing from starvation afterwards. But Stevenson laid the idea of maybe a negotiated settlement. Well, to make a long story short, as people know, Kennedy really almost alone, though with this hint from Stevenson, and then with his brother Robert pushing, and Ted Sorensen pushing, and a few others pushing, turned the tide over a few days that don't do something precipitous. Let's try to figure out what's in Khrushchev's mind. And Kennedy came to realize, because he had people like the Air Force head, Curtis LeMay, who just wanted nuclear war, it seems, or a first strike against the Soviet Union, that he was surrounded by a lot of hotheads who could end the world. And he realized Khrushchev probably was as well. And the two of them came to realize we better tamp this down. And they did. And they agreed on a deal of this removal of missiles, both from Cuba and from Turkey. The big mistake Kennedy made, and I always think it's unfair to call it a mistake because he saved the world, so you get a lot of credit for that. But the mistake he made was insisting that the deal be secret, so that it looked to the American people like he had simply faced down the Soviet Union and they had backed away, because it wasn't known that the removal of the American missiles were part of an exchange. And that wasn't known for decades, actually.
So let's talk about how Kennedy changed and what he set out to do. And of course, it was all cut short by his assassination in November of 1963.
I think first it's fair to say that being president of the United States is a tough job. And it's impossible to do right in the early days and early years because you don't get it. And our security state in the United States, which was created by the National Security Act of 1947, which created a secret security state and a private army of the United States called the CIA, which is one half its function because it does intelligence and it does private warfare of the United States. And the whole apparatus is secret and largely out of control. And it is absolutely out of control by any public understanding or scrutiny or accountability or congressional oversight today as it was in the early 1960s. Well, Kennedy came in with a lot of energy and idealism and brilliance, and he stumbled terribly in the first year with the Bay of Pigs, Cuban invasion, and then in the second year, the near disaster of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And my view is he had the potential for greatness at the beginning, and by his third year, he had become a magnificent politician and statesman of the first order, one of our truly great presidents. Not so much in the first 2 years, although the potential was there, but the growth that came through this set of trials was extraordinary. Already after the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy was so disturbed by the CIA that he was beside himself about how they had led the U.S. and his administration and himself personally into this awful debacle. He didn't trust the CIA. After the Cuban Missile Crisis and after hearing people like Curtis LeMay even essentially calling Kennedy a traitor for not launching the war or a coward, and feeling all of this pressure for war, he was profoundly disturbed and profoundly moved and profoundly scared at how fragile the world was. And he was determined to do something in 1963. And
let me just interject. He fired Dulles and he fired Bissell. So he actually took on the CIA establishment and triggered deep animus. And I want you, as you go on, to talk about this speech. But one of the things I found fascinating from your book is how few people he informed about what it was he was about to say. And so I want to make sure we talk about the content of what he said.
So Kennedy wanted to say to the American people, peace is possible, even with the Soviet Union, even with the other side. And the whole content of the speech is they are human beings like we are. They want to live. They want to protect their children. They want to have a future. And this speech is unbelievable because it's the only foreign policy speech I know of anywhere where it is not telling the other side what to do, not making threats, not reveling in glory, not saying we are number one, not saying they are evil, but saying to the American people, we need to reconsider our own position. And remember, today we're told every day by the completely irresponsible, reckless, and ignorant mass media like the New York Times, I'm going to say, because it's terrible, and like the Washington Post and others, there's no one to talk to. There's no one to negotiate with over Ukraine. And in the Cold War in 1963, it was even more like that. The Cuban Missile Crisis had just occurred. Could you even imagine negotiating with the Soviet Union? And Kennedy's whole message is, we can negotiate. They want the same things. They too will abide by treaties as long as those treaties are also in their interest. And they can be relied upon to abide by treaties that are in their interest and also in our interest. There is a benefit of cooperation. This is rational. In fact, the pursuit of peace is the rational end of rational men, says President Kennedy.
I just want to read a couple sections because it is an absolutely remarkable, and as you point out, through Sorensen, beautifully elegiac and just gorgeously written. But these are some of the things. I want to read three short sections. I speak of peace, this is Kennedy, as the necessary rational end of rational men. I realize that the pursuit of peace is not as dramatic as the pursuit of war. And frequently the words of the pursuer fall on deaf ears, but we have no more urgent task. And then he says, so let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and to the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal. And just to conclude, he asks in the speech, what kind of peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana enforced on the world by American weapons of war, not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and to build a better life for their children, not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women, not merely peace in our time, but peace for all time. I mean, this is incredible.
It gives you goosebumps. Of course, I've listened, I don't know how many dozens or hundreds of times to the speech. I've made my family listen on so many occasions. But the words are thrilling. The words are mesmerizing in their beauty. And Ted Sorensen has a big hand in that as well. And in their ability to make change. And I think one of the things that Kennedy also says in here, which is incredible, is his advice on leadership. And I don't have exactly the words here, but to paraphrase, he says, by defining our goal more clearly, by making it seem more manageable and less remote, we help all people to see it, to draw hope from it, and to move irresistibly toward it. So the goal of peace, if made to be manageable, practical, like a treaty to stop atomic testing stop atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons, is a practical, manageable step, and people draw hope from it. So the speech was so riveting and powerful. By the way, kept completely outside of the bureaucracy. It was essentially hidden from the security apparatus, from the State Department, the CIA, even the White House. Only Sorensen and Kennedy worked on it basically until the last moment. Then they said, I'm giving this. Kennedy said, I'm giving it. So it could not be vetoed by state or by the Defense Department or the National Security Council or anybody else. And he gave it. And what is amazing, absolutely amazing, is that Khrushchev heard it, was carried away, summoned the U.S. envoy, Kennedy's envoy, to Moscow, Averell Harriman, and said, this is the finest speech by an American president since FDR. I want to make peace with your president. The words were so powerful. The motivation, the ideas were so powerful. Kennedy disseminated the speech through Pravda, Izvestia, online.
Isn't that hilarious? Pravda reprinted it.
Exactly, and broadcast the speech. And within a few weeks, they had signed the agreement. Within a few weeks. Absolutely an astounding achievement. Then Kennedy, just to say, he was also the grassroots politician. He was a political guy to the core. He went out to campaign for it. And so he took his tour around the United States. The Joint Chiefs, oh, well, we don't know. They come to testify in Congress and try to knock down this agreement. And Kennedy carried the American public overwhelmingly, and then won a decisive victory in the Senate 60 years ago, just now, for the ratification of this treaty. And this is the time when we're talking is the time of the UN General Assembly. Kennedy went to tell the leaders what this meant in another completely magnificent address. And he said, this is not the end of conflict, but it is a ray of hope piercing through the clouds. And he ends his address to the world leaders assembled in front of him in the chamber of the UN General Assembly. Kennedy, having brought peace, brought hope, and all the world leaders assembled in front of him. And he says to them that Archimedes is said to have told his friends, give me a place to stand and I can move the world. Fellow leaders of the world, Let us see if we can take our stand here in this place, in this time, to move the world towards peace. And you just can't get better than that. The idealism, the hope, the practicality, and Kennedy infused the whole world with it. And then they killed him.
And we've lost it. We've lost it.
And they killed him because I'm personally convinced, after having studied this in depth for decades now, and now we have the report completely debunking the Warren Commission with the magic bullet being no magic bullet at all, but a bullet that the Secret Service pulled out of the back of Kennedy's seat and put on the stretcher, debunking the entire forensic basis of the Warren Commission. I'm pretty convinced that it was rogue elements within the U.S. government itself.
Well, Alan Dulles.
Alan Dulles,
Can't
CIA.
get more evil. Can't get more evil than that.
Exactly. We don't know exactly who, but this was a conspiracy, and it was a conspiracy against peace. And it's our security state is in full force. Our president, in my view, is not in control, and in any event has been a hardliner and a Cold Warrior, whatever you want to call it, well past the Cold War. These neocons don't understand peace. They don't understand negotiation. They don't understand diplomacy. They don't understand the nuclear threat. And one other point, Chris, of the speech that I think is so pertinent and completely neglected, Kennedy says, above all, while defending our own vital interests, nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. To adopt that kind of course in the nuclear age would be evidence only of the bankruptcy of our policy or of a collective death wish for the world. And the U.S. has gone out to humiliate Putin and to defeat Putin. And Russia has 6,000 nuclear weapons. What are we doing? What are we thinking? Of course, I take it a little bit, even a step back. I think this is, I call it the war of NATO enlargement, because I think the entire war in Ukraine came because the United States so recklessly and imprudently kept pushing NATO enlargement. Russia saying, stop. It's a red line. Stop. And then not to Ukraine, for heaven's sake, not to Ukraine, our 2,300 kilometer border, not to surround us in the Black Sea. And the U.S. is deaf to this. And then trying to humiliate Putin and doing exactly the opposite of what Kennedy said. And I take it seriously when Kennedy says in that remark about not pushing a nuclear power to a corner, he says, above all, as if that's the synthesis of what he's learned from the Cuban Missile Crisis. Above all, don't humiliate a nuclear adversary. And our people don't even know it. We don't have diplomats, and we don't have a president, in my view, that understands the job of keeping the foot on the brake. So it's a very dangerous time. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for the warm greeting and for the opportunity to be together with you. Thank you for the work that you do all over the world. Work with compassion and wisdom and technical expertise. This is exactly what the world needs. And we can feel, Sonia and I were just saying, this wonderful atmosphere and the wonderful people here. We can feel the compassion and your dedication, and it's very moving and very inspiring to be together with you. This has been quite a week with the Tang Prize and visiting here and at Suzhou University and hearing all those nice things said about you. I just want the week to continue, if I might. But I want to thank you so warmly for such a gracious and wonderful week in Taiwan. there is no problem that we're facing that we cannot solve. In fact, it's rather absurd as well as tragic that we are still facing problems of extreme poverty in this world. As of today, the average income on the planet, averaged over the 8 billion inhabitants of the planet, is $13,000 per year. $13,000 is enough to live well, to not be in hunger, to have access to education and health care, water, safe water, sanitation, modern services, digital connectivity. In other words, the average income is enough to take care of everybody, and much more than enough to take care of everybody. The fact that we are in a world, however, in which billions of people are struggling, many are dying because of poverty, and we are fighting over resources is a matter of our mindset. It is not a matter of our physical or material reality or the lack of technological solutions. That's why it's so appropriate to be in a Buddhist setting, because all of the teaching of Buddhism is about mindset. It's the way we view the reality, not the reality itself, that leads to the suffering. The suffering can be escaped if we understand correctly our own attitudes and the nature of the world that we're in. So that is what I hope we can explore together this morning. How can we better use our knowledge, our technology, our vast wealth to end the suffering of material deprivation, of hunger, of lack of access to the most basic services, because this is absolutely feasible. The most important answer, of course, is that we redirect our attention, our activities, our resources to those needs. It would not require heroism to do it. It would require basic common sense. We are spending in the world today, by the most recent estimates, $2.2 trillion on military outlays alone. $2.2 trillion per year is more than enough to end all extreme poverty. My country, the United States, shockingly, is 40% of that military spending, $1 trillion per year. It's a deranged political system which happily votes for military outlays but refuses to vote for compassionate outlays. And this is deeply embedded in our political system today. And it's making the world so much more dangerous, so much more unequal, and so much more crisis-ridden than can be imagined. And by the way, it does nothing for the American people. This is not even a case of America exploiting the world. It's America endangering the world and ruining itself at the same time. Our life expectancy in the United States has declined now for the last 9 years. Our life expectancy now is 76 years, lower than in China, much lower than in Taiwan, 9 years behind Japan, and yet we are so rich that this is simply, again, a mindset crisis and translated into institutions that do not function. And in all of that, as our life expectancy has declined for the last 9 years, our Congress has done almost nothing except raise military spending. We call it military spending, we call it defense spending, but it's not defense at all. It's offensive spending. We heard the Economist magazine, I didn't know this quotation saying that Taiwan is the most dangerous place in the world. Beware of Anglo-Saxon publications, first of all. But let me say a word about danger and ways out of danger, if I may. The only place in Central America that is not in violent conflict is the country of Costa Rica. Costa Rica is extremely interesting because in 1948, Costa Rica unilaterally eliminated its military. It banished the army. It has no army. All the rest of Central America has an army. But Costa Rica is the only country to have avoided war. Having an army does not lead to peace. It does not lead to safety. Having an army leads to coups or provocation or perceived threats from outside or manipulation from outside, especially since the U.S. trains so many of the military. But it doesn't lead to safety. And my wife and I spent the past year while I was working at UNIDO in Vienna, living in a very interesting context. Austria was one of the countries occupied by the Soviet Union at the end of World War II. Almost all of the countries occupied by the Soviet Union at the end of World War II had the Soviet troops on their territory until 1989, typically in very repressive conditions. Austria was an exception. The Soviet troops went home voluntarily from Austria in 1955. It's a very interesting case to understand about war and peace. What happened that led the Soviet Union to voluntarily withdraw from Austria and then leave Austria alone for all of the period from 1955 until today? Was it that Austria is part of NATO? No. Austria, in fact, is the one country in the region not part of NATO. What happened in 1955 was that Austria clearly declared its neutrality, that it would never accept NATO or American troops or weaponry, that it would be a neutral country. And on that basis, the Soviet Union left because Austria was not a threat. And so the troops went home. Austria became a vibrant democratic country, a really wonderful country, by the way, that has a tremendous quality of life and culture. And it was never once threatened by the Soviet Union or Russia since then, not in one single moment or one single episode, because it was not a threat to the Soviet Union or to Russia. It was a neutral country. It's a very instructive and almost completely forgotten episode in history. And it's an episode that deserves a tremendously deeper understanding, not only for Austria, but for what might have been in the world. Because one of the reasons that the Soviet Union made that step was that it wanted to set an example. The message in 1955 was, if a country becomes neutral, we leave. And the aim of the Soviet Union in 1955 was to try to convince the United States to have Germany be a neutral country. This is very interesting because, of course, Nazi Germany had caused more than 20 million deaths in the Soviet Union. And at the end of 1945, the Soviet Union, which had been more destroyed and had suffered more than any other country in the total deaths, demanded demilitarization of Germany. The United States said no. Starting in the late 1940s, the US started to arm Germany. And by 1951, the US zone of occupation, together with the British and French zone of occupation, had become the Federal Republic of Germany and had been incorporated into the new US military alliance, into NATO. And the Russians, the Soviets were very concerned about this because this was a remilitarization of a country that just a few years earlier had invaded and caused more than 20 million deaths. And the Soviet Union was saying to the United States, we need a peace treaty. We need an agreement. We need to stop the remilitarization of Germany. And the US was saying, no, we are NATO. We're against you. We will defend against you. And after Stalin's death and Khrushchev coming to power in 1955, the Soviet Union tried again. And the Austrian state declared its neutrality, and the Soviet army went home. And the message was, neutralize Germany and we can end the threat to us and we can find a new peace arrangement in Europe. The United States completely rejected the idea, said we will not have a neutral Germany, we'll have a militarized Germany. Our leading diplomat and historian in 1955, our greatest Russia expert, George Kennan, argued vigorously, let us have a neutral Germany. This way we'll have peace. This way we can end the confrontation with the Soviet Union. He was the author, no less, of the containment policy. But he said, I don't mean containment to be a new Cold War or hot war. I mean it to be a prudent policy. We should neutralize Germany. And in 1957, he gave the BBC Wreath lectures calling for this, but he wasn't listened to. So we had a Cold War and an arms race and no peace and nearly blew up the world in 1962, 61 years ago, because of a nuclear confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. And the roots of that, if you look deeply, actually involve Berlin and Germany. If you look deeply at the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was about the same issue. This is almost completely not understood, except by our finest historians. But it's not the way we tell the story at all. So the US gave up the chance for peace. Miraculously, the world survived. Then arose a very wise and peaceful and peace-seeking leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, who was truly a great man, an incredibly decent person. I had the privilege to be on his economic advisory team for 1 year, trying to help mobilize Western support for a collapsing Soviet economy. I failed completely in that because the US, again, was uninterested in doing anything, even to help a peace-seeking leader of the Soviet Union. And as you know, Mr. Gorbachev, President Gorbachev, unilaterally disbanded the Warsaw Pact military alliance in 1990. And at that moment, the leaders of the United States and Germany promised Gorbachev, we will not take advantage of that by expanding NATO even 1 inch eastward in response to your action. Of course, Gorbachev fell the next year, in part because of the financial crisis that the Soviet Union was facing, that the United States refused to help. And as soon as the Soviet Union ended, the strategists in the Pentagon and the White House and the CIA immediately began to plan the expansion of NATO. And so again, the US turned down peace. It could not take yes for an answer. I happen to be rather deeply inside the process in the Soviet then Russian side, because after Mr. Gorbachev fell from power, President Yeltsin asked me to help advise Russia. I said, surely, Mr. President, the United States will understand now to give financial help. Maybe it could not understand with the Soviet Union, but surely with an independent Russia now. And again, the United States absolutely said we're not helping at all. And so just as these two leaders were saying, we want peace, we want normalcy, we want the end of conflict, the United States began planning the unipolar world. Quite literally planning step by step. Even leaders in the Pentagon told one of the generals that I know rather well, Wesley Clark, that now the United States will launch several wars to overthrow Russian allied governments because we now know that Russia can do nothing in response. This is what Clark was told in the early 1990s. And the list included Iraq with Saddam Hussein, Syria with Assad, Libya with Muammar Gaddafi. And those are the wars that came. Those were planned wars. And the NATO enlargement was planned starting in 1992, but really planned in detail by 1997. And Zbigniew Brzezinski, the strategist and advisor to President Carter, wrote an article in 1997 explaining the timeline of NATO enlargement to Ukraine to be between 2005 and 2010. Of course, the Russian leadership said, no, don't do that. That's our red line. Don't cross it. The United States said, we don't hear you. You don't have any say in this. It's literally NATO doctrine, literally. It's enshrined in NATO doctrine that no country outside of NATO has any say in where NATO will enlarge, even if NATO is enlarging to a 2,000-kilometer border of the country. So the United States said, we will enlarge to Ukraine, and Russia, you have no say in it whatsoever. In 2007, President Putin said, don't do this. Do not do this. We're very concerned. We do not want you on our border. The United States. The United States ignored that, and in 2008 committed to NATO enlargement. This is why we have the war in Ukraine. The unrelenting pursuit of power and not listening to anybody else, to any prudent warnings at all. Interestingly, in 2008, the U.S. ambassador to Russia wrote a secret cable back to Washington. That ambassador was William Burns. He's now the CIA director. His secret memo got leaked by WikiLeaks, so we got to read it. Because other than leaks, we don't read anything of what the U.S. government really thinks. Everything is secret. And the media are not storm media. They are USG media. So we read literally nothing but what the U.S. government wants us to read. But this memo was made public by Assange. And the title of the memo is Niet means Niet. And the content of the memo was, it is not just a matter of President Putin, it is every member of the leadership of Russia that opposes NATO enlargement. Pro-Putin, anti-Putin, doesn't matter. All Russian political class does not want NATO on Russia's border. And by the way, I don't blame them for one moment. Who would want NATO on your border? Not I. But it was ignored again. Kennan was ignored, Burns was ignored, Jack Matlock, our U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, was ignored. William Perry, our Secretary of Defense, was ignored. The ones that were listened to were Raytheon. They have military establishments in every congressional district. It's jobs, it's money. They pay for all the think tanks on the East Coast. It's big business. Biden has been part of that for more than 30 years. But basically every president is by the time they get there. And so the U.S. could not listen to a red line. And then I won't go through all of the rest of the history because this is not our main topic, but it really is our main topic. In 2014, the U.S. helped to overthrow the last Ukrainian government that just wanted calm, because President Viktor Yanukovych wanted neutrality. He's being pulled by the US on one side. He's being pulled by Russia on the other side. He's trying to keep calm. So he gets the Rada, the Ukrainian parliament, to vote for neutrality. Smart man. Then Europe is saying, you must sign our agreement with us now, now, now. And President Putin saying, no, don't sign. You will divert trade. We are your major trading partner. We have to be part of this trade agreement. And Europe is saying, Russia, you have nothing to do with this. And Russia's saying, yes, but you are making a trade agreement. We already have a trade agreement with Ukraine. We're party to this. No, no, you have nothing to do with this. Because this is a game. This is not honesty. This is not grown-up behavior. And so a protest started when Yanukovych delayed signing the agreement with the European Union. And the US stoked the protest behind the scenes, pouring huge amounts of money into the protest, funding it. I know it. I saw it with my own eyes, by the way. Leading American NGOs working side by side with the government, pouring in vast money for that protest. Not saying we don't want to interfere, directly leading the protest. And then a violent overthrow of the government, and the new government came in and said, we want NATO. And then the United States said, we'll make you safe. We'll give you lots of armaments. You'll be perfectly safe. And so the US started a mass sale of arms to Ukraine, guaranteed to destroy the country. Absolutely. Clear as could be. They did it. They absolutely destroyed the country. Because at the end of 2021, President Putin made one last try, stop NATO enlargement. And on December 17th, 2021, he put on the table a draft US-Russia security agreement. And he had some very important correct points. And I'm not a Putin apologist. I am an objective observer over the last 30 years. President Putin observed the following. First, stop NATO enlargement to our border. Second, the US had walked away from the anti-ballistic missile treaty unilaterally in 2002, and it had basically ended, it started to place Aegis missiles in Poland and Romania. And Putin said, we don't even know what is in those silos, but it's a few minutes from Moscow. This is intolerable. You unilaterally left a treaty. Now we are vulnerable. The United States said, we don't negotiate with you. And in January 2022, the US gave a formal reply to Putin. And the formal reply is, NATO enlargement is none of your business. Literally, that is US policy. It's none of your business. Not that we will sit down and discuss, negotiate, try to understand your security concerns. It's none of your business. I actually called the White House on December 30th, 2021, and spoke to one of the top officials, not to the president, and begged them, negotiate, avoid a war. No, no, Jeffrey, we don't have to negotiate. It's not really about NATO, I was told. I said, if it's not about NATO, Say that NATO won't enlarge. No, we can't do that. And on February 21st, 2022, Russia Security Council met. President Putin asked Foreign Minister Lavrov, give a report of the status of your discussions with the Americans. Lavrov responded that we have received a firm reply of no negotiation over NATO. We have tried, Mr. President, but we did not succeed. The U.S. will not engage in negotiations. And 3 days later, the special military operation took place. Since then, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians are killed. 10 million have fled the country. The economic collapse is probably more than 50%. Ukraine is losing around 1,000 soldiers every day, killed or seriously wounded right now. This so-called offensive or counteroffensive is a death trap. And the U.S. knows it, but we have a presidential election coming up, so we can't quite say it, because that might be embarrassing for the president. And so Ukraine is told, keep throwing your soldiers 1,000 a day to their death or to their permanent disability. And they keep doing it. That's why we don't have sustainable development. Because we're not even trying. How many times has President Biden said sustainable development goals? I literally do not know one occasion where he has used the phrase. Can you imagine? I don't know of one occasion. One of my closest associates over the last 40 years, who was a senior U.S. official for a while, told me that it is U.S. Treasury policy not to use the phrase sustainable development goals, because they're afraid that some Republicans in Congress will object that it's going to put America on the hook with all those poor people. And America doesn't want to hear that. And to give you a real status of the world right now, every country is supposed to have a sustainable development goal plan. And they're supposed to present it to their peers at the UN high-level political forum. And each year, 30 to 40 countries present their plans to the delegates. There are 193 UN member states, and 188 of them have made their plans known to the others. These are called voluntary national reviews, VNRs. 5 countries, only 5 in the whole UN, have not made sustainable development goal plans. They are South Sudan, which has been in nonstop war, Haiti, which is in complete disaster, Yemen, which has been in nonstop war, Myanmar, which has been in nonstop conflict, and one more, the United States of America. Those are the 5. This is why we don't have sustainable development. As an economist, I've taken a particular view of this issue over the last 30 years as I came to understand it, starting in the early 1990s. And that is that for some of the things that poor people need, their governments simply cannot afford to provide them out of their own resources. So we need a world that has compassion, that provides some of the things that the poorest of the poor cannot provide on their own. And so starting around 30 years ago, I have been advocating basically nonstop that there should be more financial flows from the rich to the poor so that children in poor countries can go to school, so that they can be immunized, so that they can have a dose of anti-malarial medicine if they have a bout of malaria, and so on. And a lot of what I've done for 30 years is basic arithmetic. Thank goodness for Excel spreadsheets. I have multiplied the number of poor people by the cost of interventions, and I have shown that that amount is very small, but it's larger than the budget of the government of the impoverished country. So I have said, here is a gap, and we should fill the gap. It's not ingenious work. It's so simple that it should be absolutely the most basic exercise that any institution involved in sustainable development makes. Now, I want to explain two interesting facts about these calculations, beyond the fact that they show that a country like Niger, which just had a coup a couple of days ago, could never afford to have all its kids in school, given the impoverishment that it finds itself in right now. Maybe in 30 years it could, but right now it needs help. But here are two interesting facts. One is the IMF never uses such a calculation to decide how to address Niger or another low-income country in its actual budget programming. In other words, when the finance minister of Niger comes and the income in that country is a few $100s per person per year, and half the kids are not in school, and only 10% of the population has access to electricity, and so on, the finance minister comes to the IMF, and the IMF says, well, you have this much money, so learn to live with it, or die with it. Oh, you would like to have electricity? That's a privilege. Don't expect it. And that's literally, well, they don't say it that way. They just say, be careful, be prudent, don't spend more than you have. Not, we will help you to find the financing. So that's one part of the story. The other part of the story is interesting. For right now, in the last 2 years, I've been advising the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, and the Deputy Secretary General, Amina Mohammed of the United Nations, on what is the size of this financing gap and how could it be mobilized. And one basic part of the answer is the official banks that we established decades ago, like the African Development Bank, or the Inter-American Development Bank, or the Asian Development Bank, need to be operating at a much larger scale, because you have the needs and you have the current scale of operation, so the scale should be increased. And on that basis, Secretary General Guterres called for what we called an SDG stimulus, a financial stimulus to help close the gap of what is needed to be spent versus what is available for spending. Very straightforward. And it would involve the rich countries as a group putting in something like $100 billion a year. For the United States, $20 billion a year, for example. Now, we're a $25 trillion economy. So $20 billion is rounding error. It's not even noticeable. $250 billion is 1% of GDP. $25 billion is 0.1 of 1% of GDP. So this is 0.08 of 1% of GDP. You know what the United States just said last week? It said, we don't think it's timely to increase the capital of the multilateral development banks. Translation. The President of the United States does not want to say a word about this because maybe Congress would object and say you're wasting U.S. taxpayer money on poor people. Maybe the rich would have to pay a little bit more in tax, but that's impossible because the rich finance the whole political system. And so the U.S. says it's not timely. For who? For the people who don't have enough to eat today? For the child who's not in school today? Who's it not timely for? It's not timely for the American plutocracy. That's all. So I don't really know whether economics is needed in any of this anymore. We need Buddhism. We need compassion. We need Ren. We need benevolence. I've come to believe that the Sustainable Development Goals are as simple as the ABCs: Aristotle, Buddha, and Confucius. Aristotle, by the way, who's my favorite philosopher because I know him well, he is at the core of the glorious side of the Western philosophical tradition, had the basic idea of human beings, that human beings are a mix of animal instincts and higher rationality. And it is our purpose, our end, to think and to behave properly as rational human beings, including decently in our social order, in our political order. The Buddha, of course, and I'm here to learn from you, taught compassion as the basis of escaping the cycle of suffering. And Confucius taught virtue and cultivating virtue. And he taught that all people are brothers within the four C's, that this is one humanity and one world. If we abide by the ABCs, we will achieve sustainable development. Thank you very much.
We now have a lot of more aggressive cross-border incursions by allied Ukrainian forces into Russia, along with Biden reversing himself yet again and saying he would send F-16 fighter jets after refusing. How do you assess the actual danger of escalation in terms of the possibility of some direct U.S.-Russia military conflict, even as an episodic misperception, and ultimately the longer-term risks of things like all-out war between the West and Russia?
Well, the risks are extremely high because we have a very determined Biden administration that wants to keep escalating. Russia is absolutely determined to prevent NATO from enlarging to Ukraine for understandable reasons, in my view. It's a 1,900-kilometer border of Ukraine, and Russia does not want the U.S. military alliance on its border. And so as long as the Biden administration and the media that are absolutely supporting it and disguising the basic facts continue to push this NATO enlargement, we're going to have an escalating war. This war was completely avoidable. The party in this conflict that actually sought diplomacy repeatedly was Russia. Not something you'd read in the New York Times, actually, but the fact. And it was Russia that put on the table on December 17th, 2021, a draft U.S.-Russia security agreement to forestall the war. I actually called the White House. Soon afterwards, I said, you've got the basis to negotiate. Avoid this war. And I was told, no, we're not going to discuss NATO enlargement. That's our business. It's not Russia's business. And I said, are you kidding? This is going to cause a massive and very dangerous war. No, this is our policy and so forth. You could ask the question, if they did a little thought experiment, how would the Biden administration think about Russia establishing military bases in Mexico? Probably not thrilled. They probably wouldn't say, well, that's Mexico's choice. What are we going to do about it? So a little bit of thinking and empathy might have gone a long way. But we have heard almost nothing about it in your expertise, which I'm just amazed at day by day how the New York Times and other mainstream media twist all of this. I recently asked an assistant of mine, please do a scan for the last 2 years of the editorial pages of the New York Times. 26 times the idea of unprovoked invasion has been raised by the New York Times in its editorials, in its opinion columns of the New York Times columnists like Tom Friedman and others, and in the invited op-eds. And you just can't get a word in otherwise. You can't tell that readership you were just describing in Manhattan, where I happen to live, what's really going on. So this is the frightening part. And we're also told, Glenn, which is pretty damn weird, don't worry about nuclear escalation. Don't be blackmailed by this. My advice is worry and worry a lot. And if you have been around these issues for a while, and I have for decades, and I wrote a book about the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis and Kennedy's successful quest to negotiate a partial nuclear test ban treaty with Nikita Khrushchev, you know, if you're not worried, you just don't get it, because you better be worried. And I'm very worried about this administration not getting it.
You know, it was such a staple of Cold War culture, Cold War policy, that avoiding nuclear war was the single greatest priority as we were going around the world with these proxy conflicts against the Soviet Union. We managed never to directly engage them militarily. And even then, misperception, miscommunication did bring the world close to nuclear annihilation, at least on 2 occasions, between the Soviet Union and the United States. And yet it really does amaze me that we seem to have just kind of through, I don't know, inertia or lethargy or historical ignorance come to view the risk of nuclear war as basically a fiction, as kind of assigning zero value to it, or even this kind of macho attitude that we're not going to be deterred by a country having nuclear weapons. Talk a little bit about, you know, in the time that you've been working in all the things that I discussed in these kind of geopolitical framework, even from an economics perspective, the specter of nuclear war and how it used to be kind of important for people and policymakers in deciding what they would and wouldn't do.
You know, there was one moment when Biden was caught on tape saying, we're on a path to Armageddon. This is, I think it was the fall of 2021, if I remember.
No, 2022.
2022.
Yeah,
sorry,
yeah.
I'm sorry, 2022. Excuse me. And he was excoriated by the press the next day, rather than anybody reflecting. Oh my God, the president of the United States is saying this. He was excoriated. How dare he say this? You know, he let a tiny glimmer of the truth in. And then, of course, the whole idea was shut that up. Don't talk about that. Well, anyone that knows some history, and by the way, if you want to know some history, the most wonderful book written about this by a great historian is a book called Gambling with Armageddon by a late great historian, Martin Sherwin, who wrote about the Cuban Missile Crisis and the whole atomic age, in fact. And the book is terrifying because we came so close 60 years ago, actually 61 years ago now, to nuclear annihilation. And almost every one of Kennedy's aides would have pushed us to that. We fortunately had a president who had the sense to avoid the ultimate disaster, but almost none of his aides had that sense. And what Sherwin recalls and what we've learned from Dan Ellsberg and from so many others is how close we've come and how easy it is to come close because there's so many stupid people in our government. Believe me, this is something I can tell you absolutely. People who don't think, who are extraordinarily lacking in basic common sense, who believe that power is the only coin of the realm, who believe you really do have to be tough on whatever it is, and nuclear war will see them down. And all of this is extraordinarily reckless, and we're really in it now. And it's, of course, not just Ukraine. It's Nancy Pelosi flying to Taiwan. It's us doing whatever we can to humiliate China. It's having an absurd G7 meeting last week in Hiroshima, of all places, that the U.S., of course, bombed with the first nuclear atomic bomb, spending the whole G7, in essence, to attack China and Russia. They think it plays politics. They think it's a game. It's extraordinarily reckless and extraordinarily dangerous and extraordinarily predictable what's going on.
Yeah.
Because the real diplomats inside the U.S. have been warning about this for decades. We're only finding some of it out by WikiLeaks and by disclosures such as Bill Burns, their CIA director, who was in 2008 the U.S. ambassador to Russia, and he sent a memo that everybody should read.
For Condoleezza Rice.
2008, yeah, he explained, my God, this NATO enlargement business is absolutely dangerous. And of course, George Kennan a decade earlier, and George Kennan was absolutely brilliant and understood already in the 50s how we could have gotten out of the Cold War. But certainly in 1997, he wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, when they still ran such op-eds, that this whole NATO enlargement business was absolutely reckless. And what's interesting, when Kennan was writing that in 1997, I hadn't actually realized it until I went back and saw a reference to an article in Foreign Affairs by Zbig Brzezinski that I didn't remember, writing in 1997, laying out almost the precise timetable for how we were going to incorporate Ukraine into NATO. Now, this is years before Putin's president. This is when we're not having any war with Russia. People tell me, oh, yeah, well, they have to be in NATO. Look at Putin, madman. But this is well before, and Brzezinski lays out basically to the year the sequence of how it's going to be. The first row of countries, which was Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic. Then it's going to be the next row. Then Ukraine by 2005 to 2010, he writes, they're going to have their invitation. It turned out to be 2008. Our ambassador to NATO in 2008 was none other than Victoria Nuland. If you want to know what deep state means, she's been in every administration. She's been almost every night.
Except when Trump was elected. That's the only way apparently to get her out of the government.
Except Trump.
Yeah.
So she was Cheney's advisor. She was ambassador to NATO when we asked Ukraine to come in. She was the point person on the U.S. engagement in the violent overthrow of Viktor Yanukovych in February 2014, which started the war in Ukraine. And she is now promoted for all of this, bringing us ever closer to disaster. And by the way, putting Ukraine in the classic place in a proxy war guaranteed to destroy that country, which is exactly what it's doing.
You know, the thing that struck me so much about that Bill Burns memo in 2008, when he was warning Condoleezza Rice and others in the Bush administration about the insanity of this plan, was he said, it isn't just Putin. You go and talk to every single person of influence in Moscow, even Putin's liberal critics, and it's all, for every last one of them, a huge red line to be mucking around in Ukraine for the West, in part because of the history of the 20th century. That's what I wanted to ask you. You gave this interview in February of 2023 with Isaac Chadner of the New Yorker, who has become this hero to the liberal establishment because of these adversarial interviews he purportedly does. A lot of it is based on how transcripts get edited, how much he gets to say, how much the guest gets to say. I've done a couple of those with him, so I know firsthand. One of the points
what a low life approach to journalism.
Completely. I mean, mine I felt ended up being pretty fair, but I've seen him done incredible hatchet jobs with others, including yours, because one of the points you kept trying to make was that the premises of his questions, embedded in them, they were almost like, when did you stop beating your wife questions, were so misguided because he was distorting the history of the conflict, in part by thinking the war began either in 2022 or even in 2014 with Crimea, and you kept pointing it out, actually the start of the war is 2013 with this change of government that he was shocked you called a coup, or even before with NATO expansion, even before it got to Ukraine. So talk about those parts of the history that the New York Times, the New Yorker editors didn't allow you to have included in that article, and why you think that history is so important to understanding how we're being propagandized about the conflict now.
Well, it's a little amazing. The New Yorker, of all places, okay, maybe I shouldn't say of all places, but Remnick's New Yorker is absolutely neocon, beginning to end. The New York Times is completely neocon. I don't know if they would be, by the way, if I can't figure it out if it's just anti-Trump, pro-Biden, or they really believe the stuff that they say, but they're absolutely unwilling to listen or to learn a fact. The thing that surprised me about Chotiner was just how he knew nothing and kept making aggressive assertions. And when you tried to say something, it was just snark. So it was a really weird experience.
Well, he's playing to that audience that loves it. Like, you know, they assume all of his assumptions that he's getting from the New York Times. That's the full extent of their worldview. You kept trying to inject an alternative historical understanding, but it never made it into the article, which is why I'd love for you to offer it now about the importance of 2013 and that change of government, and even kind of going back to when NATO started expanding after the reunification of Germany eastward toward the Soviet or toward Russia.
Well, you know, I posted a piece on Common Dreams, which people can take a look at to get a lot of the hyperlinks and a lot of the underlying data and evidence. But this story really goes back 34 years. It goes back to 1989, 1990. The U.S. and Germany were both very clear to Gorbachev, who was a godsend for the world, by the way, because he really was a man of peace, and I was profoundly honored to try to help him on the economic side, though the White House was having none of it at the time. But in any event, Gorbachev believed in peace, and he unilaterally disbanded the Warsaw Pact, which was the Soviet side NATO, and Baker and Hans-Dietrich Genscher, the German foreign minister, repeated time and again to Gorbachev, and in many, many different forms, and so did the NATO Secretary General and others, we will not move NATO 1 inch eastward. We won't do it. Now, I spoke to a wonderful historian who is working on this right now, who tells me that in the archives, he's come across in 1992, not only the plans for NATO expansion, but Ukraine already on the list for NATO expansion in 1992, when supposedly in the public there is no such thing as NATO expansion at all. But remember 1992, that was Cheney, Wolfowitz, and Rumsfeld in the Bush senior administration. I thought, what could be worse? Well, we kept learning things can get worse.
Right.
Even in the Democratic Party, the love affair with the so-called liberal hegemony. I don't know what the liberal part is, but I know what the hegemony part is. That has been Nuland's thing, and of course her husband Robert Kagan's thing for decades. This has been underway since the early 1990s. Now, the Russians have been saying, and Gorbachev said, don't move eastward. We want peace. We want openness. I was actually advisor to Gorbachev. I was economic advisor to Yeltsin. I was economic advisor to Leonid Kuchma, first president of independent Ukraine. I've seen all of these people. You know what they wanted? They wanted normal life. They wanted to stop the Cold War. They did not want crazy things. They wanted normalcy. And we wouldn't give it. What we said, normalcy, yeah, that's U.S. hegemony. That's U.S. indispensable power. That's U.S. we do what we want anywhere we want when we want it. And that has been the story all along. And frankly, I couldn't imagine it at the time because I was watching with my own eyes as a young guy. Suddenly, the world had a chance for peace. And peace didn't mean U.S. global hegemony. Peace meant normal cooperation, but we couldn't accept the deal of just being normal and cooperative. We had to say, now we lead on everything. And that's been the story since the beginning. Now, there are many steps to it. Clinton was the first violator of the promises, and Clinton's so inconsistent on everything, but this is one of the things he was inconsistent on. So the first NATO expansion took place under Clinton, and that was Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic. The next NATO expansion, 7 countries by Bush Jr. in 2004, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Romania and Bulgaria on the Black Sea. So you had the Baltic states, you had Romania and Bulgaria. You're starting to, right up against Russia, Slovakia and Slovenia. Now, Putin says in 2007, stop already, stop. He says it in a famous speech at the Munich Security Conference in 2007. We don't listen at all. 2008, Bush says NATO is going to enlarge to Ukraine. The European leaders, by the way, were aghast. And one of the European top leaders at the time called me, said, what is your president doing? Of course, European leaders don't say any of this publicly, but they say privately, this is crazy. This is so dangerous. But of course, they were quiet. Bush pushed this through in 2008. Then there was a reprieve for Ukraine. The reprieve was that the president, Viktor Yanukovych, said, look, we're in between 2 giants. We don't want to be smashed in the middle. We take neutrality. But neutrality was a red flag for Victoria Nuland and her friends. And so at the end of 2013, when demonstrations against the decision that Yanukovych had made to postpone signing an agreement with EU started protests, believe me, the U.S. covertly and overtly and every other way stirred that up massively. But in January and February 2014, they supported a violent insurrection that overthrew Yanukovych. And of course, notoriously, Nuland was caught on tape, something we don't talk about, but anyone go listen to it.
She picked the next leader. She picked the new leader.
She's planning the government weeks before the overthrow, calling exactly who would be the prime minister, by the way. It's amazing. But the whole thing is amnesia. Don't talk about any of this, so though it's so obvious. And I had a weird experience personally, which was that when the government was overthrown and Yanukovych fled and Yatsenyuk was prime minister, just as Nuland said, I got a call. Yatsenyuk wants to meet you. It's a deep economic crisis. Okay, I actually respond to those things when a government says we're in a very deep financial crisis. So I flew to Kiev. And I had an NGO brag to me about the role they played in the overthrow. And it was ugly. It left me shaking. It was, the kind of thing you just want to wash that off. Don't tell me this awful stuff. You had no business being part of a violent insurrection. But that's the role we played. I went home. I didn't go back. I was disgusted by the whole thing. But it was obvious then we were on a path towards war. This didn't start with a, quote, unprovoked invasion February 24th, 22, excuse me. This started in February 2014. And it started with the U.S. participation in a coup.
Maybe a good place for me to start to discuss the issue of U.S.-China relations is with the book of a good friend of mine, someone very well known in our country, who's very clever, and I fundamentally hope he's wrong, but he keeps on being right about things, and that's John Mearsheimer. And many of you follow Professor Mearsheimer at University of Chicago. And he wrote a very good book that, again, I really disagree with, but it's a great book. In 2001, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. And as our super realist in international relations, John sees great power politics as being filled with confrontation and frictions, and basically a kind of struggle for survival, and very much a zero-sum world in which the gains of one side are the losses of the other in this power struggle. And as an economist, I see the world very differently, because the actual basic idea that goes back to Adam Smith is that an interconnected economy is a win-win proposition, that economics is not zero-sum but positive-sum, that there are gains from cooperation, gains from the division of labor, gains from specialization, gains from a large market that creates an acceleration of innovation, and gains from the fun of being in a world in which you can taste other people's food, enjoy their culture, listen to their music, travel to their societies, and benefit from cultural diversity. Well, I go back to John Mearsheimer because in his book, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, he writes that at the time of that book, it's either 2001 or 2002, I don't remember exactly, he says, great power politics is quiet right now, but we will get back to confrontation. So give him a check mark. And he said, we'll have confrontation between the US and China, because China's going to rise, China's going to become a much more powerful country, and that will lead to confrontation. And I read that and I thought, no, it's good if China rises, that's good. Win-win, gains. We want China to end poverty, to overcome the 100 years of humiliation, so-called, the great difficulties of the 19th century, indeed up to really the start of the rapid economic growth in 1978. And that will be good. Why should there be controversy? Why should there be conflict? And John was right and I was wrong. because there is confrontation and there's conflict. I'm more right than he is, though, not in prediction, but in saying there's no reason for this conflict. This is not some fundamental struggle of survival. This is not some fundamental confrontation of two systems. This is not what Biden absurdly said upon taking office, that the great struggle of our age is democracy versus autocracy. None of this. This is what Mearsheimer said. China is rich and powerful. The United States is rich and powerful. Great powers have controversy over nothing more than the fact that they're each rich and powerful. That's a dumb reason for controversy, by the way. An even worse reason to blow up the world or to talk about war as our politicians do. And my view is that we are being exposed to the unbelievable foolishness of our politicians every day. Hotheads who have not had the benefit of being at the Chinese Institute, know nothing, know no history, have no context, are ignorant, should get a passport, should go for a trip, should enjoy a holiday, and come back, calm down. But they don't. So Mearsheimer was right. We are in a really dangerous situation with China, but I'm also right. I can't see any single underlying reason for it that is a serious reason for confrontation. In economics, there's no such thing as China's gains being our losses. China is not a threat to the US economy. China is not a threat to US prosperity. China is not a threat to the US political system. We are the threat to the US political system. So there's nothing that has happened that gives me any worry about China. What gives me worry is about the structure of how the two countries are relating. So the second influential piece that I would refer to understand this is a remarkable essay, terrible in my view, by a former colleague of mine when we were at Harvard together, Robert Blackwell, well known, one of our leading diplomats. And he wrote a piece for the Council on Foreign Relations in, I think, 2016. It may be 2015. But it was about US grand strategy and China. It's really worth reading. Fascinating. Again, highly predictive, but terrible in my view, to put it bluntly. And I am blunt, so I want you to understand my point of view. So what Ambassador Blackwell wrote in 2015 or 2016 with Ashley Hellis, his co-author, is that, and it's there vividly, so it will really help if you haven't read it to understand the weirdness of what's going on. He wrote that America's grand strategy from the beginning of our country has been hegemony. First, it was hegemony over the eastern seaboard, then it was hegemony over North America, then it was hegemony over the Americas, then it was the idea of global hegemony, that the US should be the dominant power in every region of the world and not brook even competition in any other region of a regional hegemon, so-called. These are all concepts of international relations. They don't make too much sense to me, frankly, in economics, but in any event, this is how our strategists think about things. So he wrote that that is our strategy, to be dominant. And China is a threat to that strategy. That is absolutely true. If your strategy is to be dominant, Well, China's a big threat to that. Because how can you be dominant if there's a very successful country that happens to be 4 times larger in population, is doing very well, thank you, turns out hundreds of thousands of incredibly skilled PhDs in the sciences and technology? What is this dominance? How about being productive? How about being peaceful? How about having a nice life? How about having universal health coverage or other decent things which we might have in this country if we actually thought about it? But dominance, no. Then China's a threat, if that's your definition, which is mind-boggling to me, because suppose the whole world had the idea that the only goal is to be dominant. Well, if that is the way, then John Mearsheimer's right. It's all a tragedy, because not everybody can be dominant. And if that's your view, I suggest you go first to a psychologist, psychiatrist, or a good counselor, or a good friend who could help calm you down and tell you about the good things in life, but not the importance of being dominant, because that really does create a problem if that were generalized. You could think about it in a Kantian way. That does not work as a categorical imperative if everybody is aiming for dominance. So, in this essay of Blackwell, our grand strategy is to be dominant. And so he writes very clearly, China's rise is no longer in America's interest. That's pretty weird. Now, we should understand a couple of basic things. China is roughly the same size as the US economy right now in aggregate. Depends how you measure things. There are always 2 ways to measure things. One is at the prices of each country's own markets, and then you convert the yuan output to dollar output with the market exchange rate, and that's called market prices. And the other is a common set of prices that you apply to the goods and services of each country. That's called purchasing power parity adjusted prices. And by the market prices, China's economy in the aggregate is something like 3/4 of the size of the US in dollar terms. China's 4 times larger. So that would mean 3/4 times 1/4, or 3/16 the size, or roughly in per capita terms, 20% of the US economy in total size, 3/4. If you look at it at international prices or purchasing power adjusted prices, China's a bigger economy. And the IMF gives us data all the time in what is called the World Economic Outlook. You can go to imf.org and just look at the data, which I do 10 times a day for my job. And if you look at the purchasing power adjusted prices, China is about 30% larger than the United States in absolute size. So 1.3 divided by 4, because the population is 4 times larger. So in per person terms, about 30% or 35% of the US. China's poorer per capita than the United States, but it's a big economy, because 1.4 billion people is a lot more than 335 million people, which is the US population. Now, that's freaking out the policymakers in the US. They're bigger. How dare they be bigger? But it's kind of arithmetic. The only way that China could be smaller than the US is to stay at a per capita income less than 1/4 of America. But why should they? Because China's filled with clever people, with good entrepreneurs, with technology. Technology flows in this world. It always has, and it will continue to. And China now is absolutely in the front ranks of scientific breakthroughs and of technological innovation, arguably ahead in many, many sectors, comparable in many and behind in some, but a superpower in science and technology, and with superb universities and all of the things that make for a high-income country. And why not? China was the world leader for 1,000 years at least. It lost that lead by a terrible policy error in the year 1434 when the Ming court stopped the great fleet of Admiral Zheng He, and China went protectionist, and the next time it was really deeply exposed to the world is when British steamers were coming up the river to bomb the Qing imperial properties in the First Opium War. So China is going to be successful, and it's not going to stay at less than a quarter of US per capita income. It's going to continue to grow. And incidentally, you read these days op-eds, oh, China's miracle's over, China's finished, the Chinese economy is collapsing. This is so ignorant, I can't even tell you. China, by the way, will have business cycles like the United States does. It will have financial booms and busts. Nobody has figured out how to avoid financial crises in the last 300 years of market economy. So China, no doubt, has too much debt in some cities and in some real estate enterprises, no doubt. But China's going to continue to grow, and it's going to continue to narrow the gap with the United States in per capita terms. It's going to be bigger than the United States in absolute terms. It already is by one good measure, and it will be by the other good measure without doubt, unless there's global calamity of some sort, which I'm putting aside for the moment. And so the whole idea of American grand strategy is really messed up. And that is one large part of our problem right now. What Blackwell and Tellis recommended in this essay in 2015 or 2016, and when you read something on the Council on Foreign Relations, usually what's written is already policy, so it's letting the public know what the thinking in Washington is. It's not really even a trial balloon, it's already what's established. Blackwell says that China's rise is no longer in America's interest, and then there's a list of things that should be done. We should use trade policy to stop China's export growth. We should restrict the flow of technology to China. We should bolster our military alliances along the Pacific Rim countries. We should form trade groups in Asia that don't include China. One of the weirdest ideas imaginable, by the way. If they would ever look at a map, they would see that this is not really the most sensible idea in the world. But grown-ups in Washington, they're physically grown-ups. They actually did this. This was the whole idea of the TPP. Stupider, I can't imagine. But we have grown-ups that say, let's have a trade agreement in Asia where China's the lead trade partner of every one of the countries, and clever us, we won't include China. Okay, this is what passes for public policy. So Blackwell listed all the things that we should do, and we're doing all of them. First, in the instability of the Trump period, where there's a lot of noise to signal, so you never knew day to day what was really going on, nor did anyone else, including the president. But he started this process of unilateral trade measures and barking at China and generally trying to raise tensions. And then Biden came in, and I thought there would be some more grown-up behavior, as I said, and actually it got worse because it became more systematic, more systematically wrong. So what Biden did is just going through the list that Blackwell set out in 2016 or 2015, which is all the measures one takes of containment. And this is, one should understand, this is the third round of American policy in this regard. It was invented for the Soviet Union, and it was deployed in the 1950s vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. And then, interestingly, it was deployed in a lighter way against Japan at the end of the 1980s and early 1990s, because Japan became so successful that even though Japan was our ally and has no army and everything else, Japan basically became an enemy in economic terms, and the United States landed very heavily on Japan and said, you can't export anymore to us, and you have to agree to that, you have to overvalue your currency by 50%, and you have to do all sorts of things because we're not going to let you continue to have the success. And we stopped Japanese growth. So this is the third try of this. But China's not Japan. Japan is 125 million people, and China's 1.4 billion people, and Japan is under the US security umbrella, and China is an independent superpower, and it's not going to sit still the way that Japan did in the early 1990s. China's going to figure out its way around all of this. But that was a big part of what we're seeing right now. So in a deep sense, Mearsheimer was right. China did nothing special to provoke any of this other than achieving rapid economic growth and economic progress. I see nothing extraordinary, of course. Every claim of China's success is they stole it from us, they cheated. This is both fantasy and prejudice mixed together with the fact that everybody steals a bit from everybody else, so there was nothing special about what China did. But in any event, it is the playbook, contain China, and that's a big part of what's going on. There's one other part of what's happening in our relationship, which is more economic, but also playing a role. And that is that when China achieved its economic success, heavily based on export-led growth, and heavily based on export-led growth to the US market, just as Adam Smith said, this made the US richer, it made China richer, it was a win-win proposition, the strong interrelations of China and the United States. But what you learn from trade history and trade theory, both, is that a win-win proposition at the aggregate level, that the US became a richer economy because China was becoming a richer economy, also went alongside inequalities within the United States, some of which arose from trade itself. So in international trade, there are losers as well as winners. The most basic theorem of international trade, going back to Smith and David Ricardo and Paul Samuelson in the 20th century, is that the winners win more than the losers lose, so that the overall size of the economy grows. And for everybody to win from trade, the winners should compensate the losers. So the idea is a growing economy, which the US has had, should be enough for everybody to rise in that economy. But instead, there are pockets in our, not just pockets in our society, significant parts of our society that are not rising, they're falling. So the U.S. has become very rich, and the rich part of the United States has become really rich. And there are two parts of our society that are hurting. One is specifically places that are in the import competition with China, and that is the Midwest to an important extent. And those happen to be swing states in presidential elections. So Wisconsin, Minnesota, Ohio, my home state of Michigan, Indiana, Pennsylvania, and so forth. A lot of places there were hit by very high quality, low cost Chinese manufactured exports. And the second part of our society that's been hit in general is people with educational attainment of high school or less, because our society's absolutely diverged between university education and high school education on every dimension of well-being, including life expectancy, including health, including income levels, and so on. Now, in international trade theory and practice, the winners should help the losers. But we're a kind of nasty society. I think I would like to make that clear. Our political system was invented in the British mode of John Locke. John Locke, the philosopher at the end of the 17th century. And John Locke's idea was that you own your own labor and nobody should take it away from you. And that is pretty deeply embedded in the American psyche, which is, that's mine, thank you. And I don't want to be taxed. And we are a low tax society that complains endlessly about taxes. That's the American tradition. In fact, there would be no United States of America other than for a tax revolt. The British wanted to put a little bit of tax on the Americans to help pay for the post-1763 costs after the 7 Years' War, and the colonists said, hell no, we don't have to pay any taxes, and no taxes without representation, and by the way, no taxes with representation is the American way as well, because our Congress is bought off by rich people who tell them, don't you dare ever charge us more taxes. That's how the American political system works. So, simply, the winners don't like to compensate the losers in the United States. In fact, they like to say, you're losers. And so Trump ran on this basis instead of running on what a nice party in Europe would run on, a social democratic platform that says, you know, we're all one society and we're awfully rich. And we should make sure that even if you lose your job, you have health care and college education is too expensive, so we'll make sure that it's affordable. That's what a nice place would do. What Trump ran on was something completely different. He ran on tax cuts for the rich, and China is the one causing you all this. You see? Thank you, Donald. China's the one causing you all this pain. They stole your jobs. And I'm never going to let them get away with that. And so intersecting with our grand strategy, which is ridiculous, is the protectionism that comes from a society in which winners don't compensate losers, but winners deflect the blame by blaming foreigners. And Trump's whole campaign was, you can blame everyone else except rich people. Rich people we give tax cuts to, but blame the people coming up from the border from Mexico, or blame the Chinese, or blame the foreigners. That plays well. It makes a nasty society even nastier and more disorganized and disoriented. and he did a very good job of that. And the Democrats, what used to be my party before I decisively left it, I have no home politically. I'm just disgusted by all of it. The Democrats learned the lesson of 2016, which is, protectionism is the way to win power. So the Democrats are always learning from the Republicans. They learned from the Republicans in the 1980s, always advocate for tax cuts. That's how Reagan became so popular. And then the Democrat, and remember, well, you don't remember, but if you're as old as I am, you remember Walter Mondale said, he's going to raise taxes, I'm going to raise taxes, he's going to raise taxes too, he just won't tell you. And Mondale lost 49 states by saying that. And since then, no Democrat has said, we'll raise taxes. They just follow the Republicans. Then it used to be that the Republicans were free traders, and then Trump cleverly exploited the widening inequalities in the United States and turned it into an anti-China protectionism. And then the Democrats have learned that too. So, and then we have our grand strategist of our day, Jake Sullivan, who put the two pieces together and said, we can be protectionist and use this to contain China and win elections, and he's made a huge mess of everything by basically advising and helping to guide a policy where Biden came in and decided to double down on the anti-China sentiment and the anti-China policies. So in the first year of the administration, where I had a lot of former friends, they're not my friends anymore, I mean, I like them still, they don't like me anymore. But anyway, I said, now reach out to your counterparts. We know all the technocrats in China, all the economic technocrats, of course, because we trained a lot of them. They're our students. They're our friends for 30 years or 40 years. They said, no, the White House has said no contact. You can't have contact. We're reviewing our China policy. So for the first year, there was no discussion, basically. Even at the technocratic level, it was amazing. So wrong-headed, by the way. As an academic, I could keep all the contacts, talk to people, see friends, visit Beijing before COVID hit, and at least keep open channels, but the administration, no open channels at all. And then the idea was the tension must be good for our politics. We'll show how tough we are, we'll continue containment, we'll be more protectionist, we'll have a build in America policy, which is what Biden is trying to do with the Infrastructure Act and the Inflation Reduction Act and so forth. And that is how things went, basically until about 6 months ago. I would add in Nancy Pelosi's absolutely absurd and reckless trip to Taipei. You just can't imagine more irresponsibility than that, in my opinion. And she is enormously irresponsible and just playing for the home crowd. But she went, and so Taiwan is added to this, and President Tsai in Taiwan has also been, in my opinion, irresponsible by rhetoric that is very loose, very dangerous, and in the midst of all of these other tensions, just raising the stakes in a way that allow our worst hotheads, and if you want our very worst hothead, it's Lindsey Graham, dumber you cannot get, and more militaristic you cannot get. He wants war everywhere. This week it's with Iran. But before that, it was with China. Before that, it was with Russia. So this is really our state of affairs, that the protectionism, the grand strategy, the irresponsibility of Washington politicians, I think created all of this. I can't see. China made one mistake, by the way, rhetorically, and that was in 2014 when China launched the Made in China 2025 policy, which is a very smart policy calling for China to become leader in technology in 10 major areas. China said not that we want to advance in these areas. China said we want to dominate in these areas. We want to lead in these areas. That was not a good idea. It would have been much smarter to say we want to advance in these areas. We could have saved a lot of grief by a different kind of rhetoric. So this is my basic interpretation of where we are right now. I said that it came to about 6 months ago when things were really boiling. I mean, very dangerous. The balloon incident, the war in Ukraine going not the way that the United States wanted or expected, another debacle of US foreign policy, terrible debacle, because that's a war that never should have happened, and it was a war caused by this relentless idea of NATO enlargement to Ukraine, which is, talk about red lines. It's like Taiwan, but from Russia's point of view. You don't put the US military on the Ukraine-Russia border, and they couldn't figure that out because they're not very clever at thinking through the eyes of the other side. So 6 months ago, things were really getting out of hand, and here we are. I think they decided about 6 months ago, this is not good. We need to start dialing back. And so that's why several of our cabinet secretaries went to China, why the rhetoric was toned down. Still, they can't quite calibrate this, because even when, say, Janet Yellen went, and she was saying we want good relations, Biden was at the same time signing another unilateral executive order to tighten the restrictions on technology exports to China. So we can't so far sustain quiet and calm. But I think the intention right now is, with an overloaded US foreign policy, a failing war in Ukraine, a disaster in the Middle East, a president that's very unpopular, running against a probable convicted felon. It's a great scene. They want not so much tension in the next 12 months, and I think that that is the goal right now. And since there's no deep reason for this conflict, other than the ones that I've described, it would not be hard to dial back the tensions. It's not as if we are at dire loggerheads over anything real. We are in a constructed confrontation out of mindsets, not out of direct clash of interests. So finally, I am late and have to go, and am hogging the mic. China will have its ups and downs, but the main direction is not like that. The main direction is up. The most basic thing to watch is education, technology, and innovation. And on that, China's in the first ranks. And for an economy at China's level of development, that's the key. And that's not going away. That's going to continue. And China is leader, rightly, in many important technologies for the next 30 years, in digital technologies, in electric vehicles, in renewable energy, and many, many things. And the U.S. might continue to try to contain China, but it can't do it. Even the technology cutoffs will not have much effect at all. China's busy innovating around the microchips, and I would not worry too much about that. And if the U.S. blocks the U.S. market for China's goods, there's a whole world outside of the U.S. that wants Chinese goods, and that's what the Belt and Road Initiative and other similar initiatives of China, like the BRICS expansion, are after. So all in all, China will continue to develop. We should view that absolutely positively. It means better lives for the Chinese people. It means better opportunities for the world economy. It's better for the United States. China's progress is plus for the United States, and we should try to help our politicians make sense. Thank you very much.